Like I would assume almost everyone watching this video, I once wondered how we got from this to being able to read tomb inscriptions, fictional works, peace treaties and so on. We talk about deciphering the hieroglyphs, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg. You could memorize every hieroglyph, and you'd learn a few words along the way because some of them are words in their own right, but you wouldn't have learned a whole language. I always found there was a bit of a gap in the story. I knew by rote that the Rosetta Stone was the key to understanding Egyptian, but how? It's not like it's a Greek-Egyptian dictionary, and its inscriptions aren't a word-for-word translation of each other anyway. So why did the story of this stone, and a man called Champollion who magically taught the world Egyptian, never quite satisfy me? First of all, because that's not the whole story, but more than that, the Rosetta Stone is only a part of it. On its own, the Rosetta Stone wouldn't have gotten us as far or as quickly. So, this video is my attempt to tell the story of how Egyptologists can read Egyptian with confidence as a result of the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. I'm also going to reduce the multiple parallel efforts involved in reawakening the Egyptian language to 4 men, but I want to note now that like many scientific endeavours, this was a huge project with just a few names attached to it by history. Yes, some deserve more credit than others, and there is a reason that Young and Champollion are particularly worthy of honouring, but all of us stand on the shoulders of giants, and the great men of the Enlightenment were no different. In fact, these great men owed a lot to the small community of Egyptians who kept the last vestige of the Egyptian language alive for centuries after the fall of the pharaohs. The Rosetta Stone story picks back up with the Baron d'Ussassi. So, the Rosetta Stone itself is tucked away in the British Museum, but prints of it are in the hands of linguists, historians and gentlemen scientists throughout Europe, particularly in Britain and France, the 2 countries who tussled over ownership of the stone. Over to d'Ussassi, who was the first French scholar to tackle the Rosetta Stone. He started off from some flawed assumptions, the most crucial being that demotic only had 25 characters. This was inherited from the Greek historian Plutarch, who doesn't seem to have grasped that hieroglyphs and demotic both had phonetic components. They weren't just signs with specific meanings. d'Ussassi is credited with transcribing the name Ptolemy, and a few others besides, but he didn't get too much further. One of my favourite parts of his story is that he made an incorrect speculation that others came to believe, which, even though it was false, did lead to the correct transliteration of the hieroglyphs. d'Ussassi believed that the cartouche was used when hieroglyphs were spelling phonetically, such as in the case of foreign words like Ptolemy. We now know he wasn't quite right about that, but by highlighting that words like Ptolemy appeared in cartouches, d'Ussassi coincidentally set future scholars on the right path, including his student and soon-to-be rival, Jean-François Champollion. This guy was the Mozart of the humanities, and I'm not one for waxing too lyrical about the works of gentlemen scholars, but when you've got a guy delivering lectures at the age of 16, demonstrating a link between hieroglyphs and Coptic, well, sometimes people are famous for good reason. Now, he wasn't right about everything. For one thing, he thought that Demotic was an early system used to write Coptic, but without his work linking Coptic to earlier forms of Egyptian, later work on the Rosetta Stone wouldn't have borne the fruit it did. Back to Champollion a bit later. First, we have to go to good old Blighty to catch up with a British polymath called Thomas Young. He set about trying to find patterns both in the Rosetta Stone's hieroglyphs and the hieroglyphic inscriptions found elsewhere. He soon realised 2 things. Each hieroglyph couldn't be a word, or else the hieroglyphic message on the stone would be far longer than the Greek one, and that hieroglyphs and demotic characters included both phonograms and ideograms. In other words, some of them made sounds, some of them carried meaning, and some of them did both. It's important to point out here that young Champollion and the others might have been a bit behind the times. Attempts were made by Islamic scholars as far back as the 7th century CE to gain an understanding of the hieroglyphs, and it was believed that the Coptic Christian monks retained the ability to read them, though this seems unlikely and we'll never know for sure. Very little of this Islamic scholarship has survived intact, but it's important to note the considerable strides made by Ibn Washir, a 10th century Iraqi polymath who made a lexicon of hieroglyphs into Arabic. Though the accuracy of his work is disputed by modern scholars, Ibn Washir made one crucial discovery. discovery. The hieroglyphs were both phonetic and ideographic, something that young Champollion and their peers didn't know when they started their work. One problem that Young had to face was that there were very few Egyptian words that used a standardized spelling, as many signs in different combinations made the same sounds. But he had the name Ptolemy and the revelation that some words were written in cartouches, albeit for the wrong reasons. Now, he tried pairing the hieroglyphic name Ptolemy with the demotic text, under the speculation that demotic signs were derived from hieroglyphs. Young didn't stick at it in an active way. After publishing his Ptolemy findings, he was involved in a lot of projects and, fundamentally, was concerned with hieroglyphs as an encryption puzzle, rather than as a linguistic one. He did retain interest in the topic, but a little more passively as time went on. Another Englishman, William John Banks, acquired an artifact we now call the Philae obelisk. Like the Rosetta Stone, it featured writing in 2 languages, though sadly the Greek was painted rather than carved, and although he did copy it out at the time, the original text has since been lost to the English weather. Banks made progress with the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra, but ultimately only under the false assumption that the cartouches contained phonetically spelled words, and the rest of the Egyptian was logographic, that is, the language usually only records meaning rather than sounds. Champollion, well, Champollion might say he adapted Banks's work without credit, but we can go ahead and call it plagiarism. Anyway, Champollion saw Banks's work about the name Cleopatra, and this was perhaps the spark that lit the final fuse. Noting several characters in common between Cleopatra and Ptolemy, Champollion mapped out the rest of both names, with reasonable accuracy. He did find some discrepancies in the spellings, but reasoned that these were homophones. His transliteration differs a lot from how we would now write Cleopatra, partially because at this time Champollion was under the assumption that hieroglyphs recorded vowels, since Coptic did, and he rightly believed that Coptic was an evolution of Egyptian. Using his proficiency in Coptic, Champollion looked at this name. From Ptolemy, he knew the signs for the S sound, and this hieroglyph looks a lot like the sun, so he speculated that it might mean sun, and sun in Coptic is Re. Re something says. Could this be the Ramesses mentioned in Manetho's writings? In which case, this sign is Mes or Messe, which is awfully close to the Coptic Mise, to give birth to. And wait, if that's Mise, and it shows up here, next to a sign that we know means Thoth, because Thoth had been mentioned in ancient Greek texts, and his association with the ibis was known to classicists, then could this be one of the Thoth Mises, the Thutmoses, as we call them now? Aside from being very satisfying, this revelation was evidence for an exciting conclusion. Hieroglyphs weren't just phonetic when writing foreign names, they were phonetic when writing Egyptian names, and Egyptian names were phrases in the language. It now became clear that hieroglyphs were both phonetic and ideographic. Fueled by this excitement, Champollion translated the Greek Rosetta Stone passage into Coptic, trying to find more Egyptian phonemes. It soon became clear that consonants were pretty well preserved between Coptic and Older Egyptian, but vowels, for the most part, were absent from the hieroglyphic script. The legend goes that when Champollion pieced together more phonetic values for Egyptian, he rushed to his brother's side and shouted, "I've got it!" and promptly fainted, remaining in a giddy state for several days. I, for one, have solved the Jindosh lock more than once without help, and I've experienced similar relations, so me and Champollion, comparable geniuses, really. Champollion refined his transliteration scheme with reference to other hieroglyphic inscriptions, focusing on names since those had been most carefully preserved by Greek writers, and in 1822 he presented his findings in a 44-page booklet to an audience that included Thomas Young. 2 years later, he published Précis du système hiéroglyphique, a summary of the hieroglyphic system, in which he gives the following overview of Egyptian.
Hieroglyphic writing is a complex system, a script all at once figurative, symbolic, and phonetic, in one and the same text, in one and the same sentence, and, I might even venture, one and the same word.
Young, historically, and even now to a great extent, doesn't get much credit for his role, and he was a little bitter about it at the time, but looking at the scale of the accomplishments, to Young and Banks, hieroglyphs were a code to be cracked. To Champollion and I think Desassi, they were the key to Egyptian itself. In the end, if I were being glib, I'd say that's the difference. Young deciphered a writing system. Champollion resuscitated a language. Through his work, we now have vocabulary, grammar, etymology, and a sufficiently nuanced understanding of Egyptian over time that there are Egyptologists who could tell you what stage of the language they're looking at as easily as you or I could tell the difference between this and this. Just like Champollion, the Rosetta Stone was not alone in its contribution. Arguably, without the Philae obelisk and a few artifacts besides, Egyptian would have stumped scholars for another generation. But even Young gave credit to his rival where it was due. In a private correspondence he noted, even if he did borrow an English key, the lock was so dreadfully rusty that no common arm would have strength enough to turn it. Others created the clues, but it took Champollion, or someone with his skills, to put the clues together. And so the Rosetta Stone became the link in the great chain from now to a previously unimaginable past. But whose past? Is this really an Egyptian story? Because it sounds like it should be, but the only Egyptian I mentioned lived as far back as the 10th century. Well, like everything in the British Museum that hails from elsewhere, the stone is the subject of a question. Where does it belong? Next week, I'll look at arguments for and against the return of the stone to Rosetta. I know I have some Egyptians in my audience, which is fantastic. If you have a view on the Rosetta Stone and where you think it belongs, let me know in the comments. I'll try to take your views into account next week, and I might even quote you. If you'd rather not leave a public comment, you can always DM me at Twitter, where you can find me at armchair_Egypt. Thanks for watching. I hope that this was a helpful explanation of the stone's place in our understanding of Egyptian. I did leave some details out, but nothing I thought was important to understanding the flow of events. As always, if you have any questions or corrections or what have you, comment below and click the little thumb if you did like the video. The giants on whose shoulders I stand are my backers at patreon.com/armchairegypt, whose names I would put in cartouches if that wouldn't take up too much space. Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity, and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community. There's an invite link in the description.